So we're going to be looking at the state of the Washington economy through the lens of our flagship model PI Plus. But first, before we look at where it's going, let's take a look at where Washington is right now. It is currently one of the fastest growing states, looking at population and output, driven in part by a leading role in exports, as well as a large concentration of STEM workers in the state. It is also a very urban state. It is a very divided state in that much of the population is concentrated in the urban Puget Sound region, with a much sparser rural population in the rest of the state. If you want to take a look at the economy of a state, you're going to have to look at a lot of facets. You have to consider a number of different factors when assessing in which direction the state is going in. But broadly, you can divide things into two factors. You can have economic factors and you can have demographic factors. So if a state has strong industries, high-paid workers, and an influx of younger population and migrants, that puts it generally in the favorable category. And then if a state has shrinking industries or high business costs or a much older population, then that tends to put it in the unfavorable category. And so when you take these two together, you can start plotting things out on this little quadrant. So the y-axis here, the vertical axis here is employment, higher or lower, or going up and down. And then the x-axis, the horizontal axis, is the population, whether you have unfavorable population on the left or favorable population trends on the right. So in the top right, you have the best of both worlds. You have increasing employment and economic activity, as well as an increasing, more vibrant population. These are our growth economies, which include Colorado, Texas, and our state du jour, Washington. And then on the bottom left, you have these transitional economies, where for whatever vagaries of the economic moment, you see lower employment, you see people leaving the state, and this includes states like Maine and West Virginia. There also are states where the patterns clash or are moving in different directions. So looking at Massachusetts, there is unfavorable population, people are leaving the state, or there's an older population or high housing prices. But then employment and by proxy economic activity are on the rise. So hopefully for Massachusetts, this increasing economic activity will drag more people in, or I'm sorry, lure more people in into the state, possibly reversing this population trends. And then on the bottom right, you have lifestyle economies like Hawaii and Virginia, where people are going to live there for even if the employment prospects are not as good. Maybe there is something about the state, maybe there's more amenities, maybe the environment is better, maybe there's something else that is attracting them there beyond strictly economic reasons. But for now, we're going to look at Washington and see how it ranks up in some of these regional growth categories. Oh, and first here is our scatter plot that looks at the where states are compared to the average of the nation. So if we take a look here, here is Washington, the starred state in the top right. Employment growth over the course of 10 years in the United States was 15.6%, and in Washington, almost 20%. Population growth in the U.S. during that same time, 6.6%. Growth in Washington State, 13%. So by both measures, Washington is outpacing the rest of the country on average. So that's where Washington is. That more or less sets the scene. So let's talk about some forecasting and what our forecasting is based on. So REMI works by creating a standard national control and then using region-specific data, using census tracts and population surveys and region-specific features, the national level percolates down to the regional level. Now, normally what we use is the Bureau of Labor Statistics forecast data. Things have been a little hectic in the past year or so. And so in order to keep up with the times, we've been making use of the University of Michigan Research Seminar on Quantitative Economics, which has been updating short-term quarterly forecasts. So we have the November update and coupled with a longer-term CBO economic outlook update. Now, as a note, This update that we'll be showing our data from does not include the $1.9 trillion stimulus that is currently winding its way through Congress. The good news there is that the RSQ will be releasing an update hopefully this month, and then by next month, Remedy will be able to provide its own up-to-date national forecast. Excuse me. So here we have our short-term outlook in Washington, and right now we'll be looking at some of the economic factors before moving on to population. So short-term, we're looking around a period from 2020 to 2023, as well as including 2019 as part of our projections. Going from 2020 to 2021, obviously you're going to see a lot of growth as the state recovers from the COVID-induced downturn. So personal income grows by 2.4%, 5.2% increase in GDP and output, and total employment goes back up by 196,000 jobs. But if we take a look at total employment, things get back to normal by around 2021, and then continue growth through 2023. Same with looking at some of the other categories. So GDP is slightly on the rise, output as well, and personal income a very slow but very slow growth, but still there. So Washington is on a pretty good track economically. Looking at its industries, some of the most important or the largest sectors in the economy by employment figures are state and local government, or real estate, information services, and manufacturing. And so these industries, some of these most important industries increased by 35,000 jobs going from 2020 to 2021, and are increased to or projected to go on the rise looking into 2023. Population, things get a little bit trickier. So these operate on longer terms, on broader speeds. And so looking at 2021, we get a sort of snapshot of where things are going. But some of the generational shifts might be better captured in the longer term outlook. But still we can see, next to no population change from 2020 to 2021. We are also seeing low birth. We can see a high number of people working age 25 to 50, but we also see sort of a dip in the younger set, the youths, as well as an older set. So what it looks like maybe is that we're going to have an aging population, but we'll see where that comes from and what might be done with that later on. In fact, this slide. So here we have our breakdown of what's causing the changes in population. We have our starting population on the right-hand side at around 7.8 million, and then our ending population on the right-hand side about 7.9 million. So we see, so we see a jump of about 1 million net. A lot of that's driven by births coming in at 100,000, and it also migration. So net economic migrants, who are people moving into the state looking for economic opportunities of working age, and net international migrants. So taken together, these sum to about 110,000 people, exceeding the number of births in the state. And this is enough to overcome the deaths in the state as well as retired migrants. So this is a group of retired age population Remedy who will move around from region to region looking for a place to live and are less driven by or not driven by economic opportunity. So we're seeing that migration into the state is a key important or an important part of its demographics. We can also provide a county level map of the state. We're not just looking at the state as a whole, but some of its individual components. This is its population heat map, with the darkest colors having the greatest population. And as I had said earlier, a lot of the population is concentrated in the Puget Sound area, so Tacoma, Seattle, etc., with Snohomish, King, and Pierce County. And then the population increase is expected to go up by around 90,000, about 100,000 in the population, in the most populous counties. Economic migrants compared to the state, compared to the rest of the country, Washington is receiving the greatest amount. So we can see some of the paler states are seeing a net outflow of economic migrants, and the darker states are seeing a net inflow of economic migrants. And Washington is seeing the greatest, but also Oregon, North and South Carolina, while maybe like moving away a little bit out of California, Texas, and New York. So we're seeing patterns, we're seeing demographic shifts from some of the highest, or in the case of California, perhaps some of the highest cost of living states to elsewhere. Now let's take a look at the longer term. So the way outlooks look in REMI, or forecasts work in REMI, is that there is a dynamic aspect. So some of the, so what determines where the state is or the region is in 2025, for instance, is determined by what happened in 2024. And we'll take those trends and extend them to see what is the general path of where things might be going. Now, this isn't going to predict business cycles. This isn't going to predict the next recession. If you do find the software that does, please let me know. I have some stocks to short. But this should give you a general idea of what Washington State's trajectory is. So we're seeing 2.3% growth in annual growth in income, same with GDP and output, and a gain by the end of 38,000 jobs. So the state is definitely on the up and up economically. Looking at it by industry, we said the 4 leading industries were state and local, by employee size, were state and local government, manufacturing, real estate, and information services. And we can see, there is an increasing prevalence of state and local government. But we can see a general swap, has been seen elsewhere in the rest of the country, from manufacturing, from, let's say, heavy industry to services. As information continues to rise and real estate begins to exceed manufacturing in terms of number of employees. This gift of the population pyramid shows, what we expect to happen by age group, and we see a generally growing population. Fortunately, it looks like the younger population, that dip that we had seen earlier, starts to fill itself out by 2060, giving a younger population base. But also, we see the number of retirement age, or we see the retirement age population rising as well. So that aging population is still going to be a concern, or something to keep an eye on, even into 2060. And again, for this data, for our demographic data, we make excellent use of things like the American Community Survey and the decennial census to generate our projections. So 2060, again, like population is growing, but again, still low birth rates. It's growing very slowly, going from 2019 to 2060. Still a high quality of life, but we still see that aging population. And again, the concentration of material, of population in the Puget Sound area persists throughout. So that is something that is sort of baked into what the state is at present. So that was generally a look at where the state is going, but all of that came from a top-down national perspective. So we use national data and regional particulars to percolate the national effects to the regional economy. But there are things that happen, there are things that take place in the regional economy that are not captured at the national level. Maybe there are certain, like a power plant opens up in a particular state, or in this case, a large business decides to shutter a factory. So let's talk about Boeing. Boeing makes airplanes, and because of the pandemic, fewer people want or can afford airplanes. Travel demand has slashed dramatically owing to how unsafe the virus is and various quarantines. The virus has also depressed economic activity in certain sectors, reducing incomes and reducing the ability for people to travel further. And so, in response, Boeing is considering cutting its global workforce from 160,000 to 130,000. But Boeing has the bulk of its employees in Washington state. So we want to test out a refinement of what happens when there is a decrease in employment in the aviation sector by about 10,000 people, 10,000 jobs. Why it's important to model something like this is that it helps influence, or it helps paint a fuller picture of what's happening in the regional economy. And once you have that better picture, you can start using it, you can start leveraging it to design better policy, to implement better policy. So if you're trying to combat, a certain shift in industry which is increasing inequality, it helps to know, well, how far is that industry going? And REMI gives you the data, it gives you the numbers that will back up your arguments as you try to implement this policy. So now I'm going to turn to a model demonstration, and we're going to go through our national 51 region model, as well as our more refined, but more detailed single state model of Washington broken out into counties. And we're going to take a look at what happens when Boeing decides to cut 10,000 jobs and where that places the state's long-term outlook. Excellent. So just looking at the inputs here, we'll be looking at this from a 10-year horizon from 2021 to 2030. So we assume these job cuts are permanent. And we are looking at the industry of other transportation equipment manufacturing. Depending on the level of specificity, REMI goes to 2, 3, or 4-digit NAICS codes, each with a subsequently more detailed array of industries. So you can go from really general, from manufacturing, all the way to the very specific steel and iron product, depending on what you need to look at. So let's take a look at the results here. So this is just for Alabama, but let's swing it really quickly to the state as a whole. And we're going to look at Washington along some of the same axes that we had done earlier in terms of economics and demographics. So here are our levels of economic migrants in the final year of this, at the end of the timeline we have. And we see Washington doing pretty all right with still a net 17,000 economic migrants. But we can see how that has changed from its previous 2030 outlooks. Oops, range. There we go. So we see migrants have fallen in the state by around 1,300. There we go. So net migrants in the state have fallen by around 1,300 in the year 2030. And we can see that the effect is very small and ambiguous across the rest of the state. Those migrants have been somewhere, but the effect is concentrated in Washington and diffused across the rest of the country. And that makes sense. But this is only 1,300 in the final year. This is cumulative. So year over year, we're getting 1,000 or 1,200 fewer migrants. We're starting to put a dent into what we expect the population to be. Same with GDP, as the effects will accumulate over time. So we have percent change. Let's do percent change. So again, effects in the rest of the country ambiguous. We see tiny decreases in Montana, Idaho, Oregon, Washington's neighbors, where some of that interstate commerce might be dragging down the rest. But then we see, California down slightly, Missouri up a tiny bit. But what's really important is Washington with a GDP decline of 1.4% in 2030. So we're even looking at that over 10 years, you're seeing a lot of lost economic potential that comes from this. And then personal incomes should follow, roughly the same track. They should be moving together. And we're seeing the percent change there as well. So where we had the 1.4% decrease in all economic activity in the state in GDP, we're seeing a 0.75% decrease in incomes. So let's take a, so that's at the high level national scale. Where does Washington fit in with the rest of the country? But let's zoom in. Yes, why not? Let's take a look and zoom in on what's happening at the regional level, at the county level. So the inputs are going to be the same. We have this 10,000 job decrease in what should be the aviation manufacturing sector across the state. And let's take a look at the results. Also, I see that people have started asking some questions. Excellent. There will be a Q&A session after this presentation where Nina May and I will be more than happy to answer whatever you throw at us. So rather than going through this specifically county by county, let's take a look at that heat map. So we have economic migrants as levels, but let's take a look at differences. So one of the things that REMI does is that you can, there is a certain, like, it accommodates for whatever level of specificity you have. So in our case, we know that the jobs are lost in Washington, but we may not have a precise idea of where they should go. And so REMI will allocate changes that are made at the state level, region by region, depending on how much industry is represented. So in our case, you know, we see job decreases here and there across the state, and that makes sense. But some of the biggest changes come in Snohomish County, which is actually the home of Boeing 787 Dreamliner plane, so a lot of manufacturing workers. And then so we're seeing a huge decrease in economic migrants because that's one of the states that has the highest impact. King County, Pierce County, we're seeing some changes there, but not as big. But let's take a look at GDP. So we see that King County has, or not GDP, employment. So we see that King County has the highest concentration of jobs, the densest population, but Pierce County and Snohomish doing all right as well. And let's look at differences. So these are, again, these are differences in our baseline before we had that 10,000 aviation decrease. Kings County sees the biggest decrease, losing about 21,000 jobs in 2030, and Snohomish County as well, seeing a decrease of 14,000 jobs. Now, the way that works is that the effects of what's happening in the economy propagate through the economy. This isn't just a matter of saying, well, 10,000 people are no longer out of work, or I'm sorry, are out of work. That's it. No, because that decrease in employment means a decrease in output for the relevant industry, and a decrease in demand from all of the feeder industries, a decrease in intermediate demand, you know, for all of the metal workers, all of the financial services large companies take advantage of. So there's that effect, and then you have the additional effect, or the induced effect, of that decrease in employment translates to a decrease in consumption. Those people there's 10,000 jobs that are no longer earning wages, 10,000 productive jobs that are no longer earning wages, and so a number of other industries, like retail, motor vehicle purchasing, those also take hits. So it's not just 10,000 jobs, it's so much more than that. So that's broadly what might be happening in Washington. This is the general shape of what a possible Boeing closure or a Boeing shrinkage might look like. So let's run through some final thoughts, and then we can open things up to wider questions. There we go. So for Washington, by and large, things look good for the state. Even with the downturn in Boeing, that's enough to dampen. That's enough to really knock the state off its stride. But we still expect to see steady economic progress going forward. Another thing that I am sure you all know, but still bears repeating, is that economic forecasts are very tricky beasts. As we have just seen in the past year, we have seen the outbreak of a once-in-a-century pandemic. Just last month, we swore in a new United States president with radically different policies from his predecessor. And even if things are ticking along normally, even at the best of times, there is still, uncertainty as to what will happen next if things are going to take a sudden lurch. And so that's a void that Remy can step in to help fill. At the most basic, there are forecasts with macro modeling, with national forecasts. We can predict what's happening at the regional level across a large horizon. But on top of, and then refine things with better regional data, or present our users with the opportunity to refine things with better regional data to tune the results for greater accuracy. On top of those forecasts, we give the chance for simulations to test out what-if scenarios. What if there is an economic downturn again in 2 years? What if Boeing decides not to close a plant, but migrate another plant into Washington State? And so a lot can happen, and Remy gives you the chance to very quickly test out what-if scenarios and a number of what-if scenarios in order to be prepared for not any situation, but more prepared than you might otherwise be. And the results are dynamic, they build on each other, and the components of the economy work together in a very organic way. As we saw with Washington, it's not just a matter of one set of jobs going away, but all of the feeder jobs, the consumption categories. So these results build on each other and start adjusting over time, again, to prevent that more accurate picture of the economy.